I'm Glenn Campbell. I call myself a demographic philosopher. I'm looking at life and trying to predict the future through the lens of demography, or the study of human populations. And today I want to talk about government birth incentives. That is, all the ways that governments around the world try to encourage their citizens to have more babies, because a lot of governments are in deep trouble and they realize this. A number of countries are losing population rapidly, like Japan and Bulgaria, and most of the rest realize that they soon will be losing population. And more importantly, they will soon be losing working age population, which is the people who really run the economy, who pay the taxes and who buy the stuff and who keep your economy afloat. If populations fall, and especially the population of that key working age demographic, then your economy is in trouble because it can't pay for all its services and can't pay all its debts. So you have a lot of governments scrambling to do something to try to bring their birth rate back up. So in this podcast, I'm going to talk about all those things that they're doing and how ultimately they're not working, and ultimately they won't work, because no matter what you do, no matter how much money you throw at the problem, it never really addresses the full cost of parenthood. So the kind of incentives that governments offer fall into several broad categories. There are actual cash payouts where you pay people for each baby that they have. Russia, for example, has an incentive program where they give parents $9,000 for each baby after the first. So you don't get any payment for your first baby, but for all subsequent babies, you get this baby bonus of $9,000. This can also take the form of tax credits. You may get a certain amount of tax credits at the end of the year for having a certain number of children, and that sort of thing applies in the United States and many other countries. Then you have subsidized services. For example, childcare. A government can offer free or subsidized childcare to its citizens, making parenthood a lot less costly and difficult. We also have parental leave programs where when you have a baby, the government essentially provides you free salary to stay at home and take care of that baby. Among all the countries in the world, it's only the United States that doesn't have any kind of federally mandated parental leave program. Most of the others have some sort of program where they actually pay parents to stay at home with their newborn children. Finally, you have the kind of incentive that really isn't hard to pin down, and that's just providing a good society for people, a safe environment for people, a place where people feel secure enough to have children. And that doesn't fall into any one single category. That's just sort of the whole tenor of the society. So governments around the world are trying all of these methods right now, and many of them claim that they're working. For example, when Russia increased the baby bonus, it seemed that birth rates were rising, but really there's no way to tell. You can't come up with any scientific consensus about whether or not any of these programs work because you don't have a control sample. You don't have a control group. For example, if one government offers $10,000 for each baby, you don't know if that works because you've got no set of parents in your country who are not receiving the $10,000. So if a parent is going to have a baby anyway, they're very happy to receive that baby bonus. But there's no evidence so far, and no real easy way to collect that evidence to prove that offering the $10,000 really changes anybody's mind. So what I want to do here is run through each of these incentive programs. And since we don't have any empirical evidence, we can at least run through the logic of them and put ourselves in the shoes of prospective parents and see whether they would be tempted by these incentive programs. The first thing we have to understand about governments is that they have basically two ways of encouraging people to do their bidding. One is the carrot and one is the stick. The stick is punishment of some kind. The carrot is some sort of incentive. Now, it turns out that sticks work extraordinarily well when you're trying to reduce the birth rate. That's exactly what China did when it instituted its one-child policy. It punished parents who had more than one child, and these punishments could be severe. They can fine parents who have more than one child. They can refuse to acknowledge the existence of the second child and refuse to give him the proper credentials to be a citizen. There's all sorts of ways you can punish people into not doing something. Unfortunately, you can't use the stick. You can't use punishment to encourage people to do something. You can use it to force them to not do something, but it's much harder to force them to do something. You can't force people to have children. Short of kidnapping women and raping them, there's really no way to punish your citizens into having babies. Instead, you have to use the carrot. You have to use incentives. You have to somehow bribe people into having babies. And unfortunately, that doesn't work much better if the bribe isn't commensurate with the costs of the action you're trying to encourage. So that brings us to the baby bonus concept, the idea of just giving people cash for every baby they produced. Well, at best, this is only going to encourage the stupidest parents to have children, because anyone with a brain and some math ability is going to add it up and realize that the cost of having a child and raising them to maturity is far more than any baby bonus any government can give. Sure, the Russian government gives you $9,000, but how does that compare to the total cost of raising a child to maturity? In the United States, it's often said that it costs $500,000 or at least $250,000 to raise a child. And maybe it's a little less than that in Russia. Maybe it's only $100,000. In that case, if you're taking the $9,000, if the $9,000 has encouraged you to have a baby, you're getting a raw deal because it's barely a drop in the bucket compared to the high costs and risks of parenthood. So this baby bonus is what the stupid governments offer for their stupidest citizens. Some of them may take it, but it's the same sort of people who buy lottery tickets, thinking they're a good investment. They just see the bonus they get right now, and they can't look ahead 20 years to see all the costs along the way. So the trouble with the baby bonus, of course, is that people are going to take it whether or not it changed their minds. So anyone who has a second child in Russia is going to apply for this baby bonus. But that does not prove that the bonus itself changed their opinion, changed their behavior. And if in fact it did change their behavior, it has this perverse effect of having only encouraged the stupidest people to have babies. It's not encouraging the professionals, the best equipped parents to have babies. It's encouraging the worst equipped parents to have babies. One step above this is improving family services. So one of the reasons in the United States that I might not want children is the huge cost of childcare, which for many parents tops out at about the same amount of money they're paying for rent just to keep your child in a daycare center. So if the government can mitigate those costs, it's reducing the stress on parents, you're reducing the financial distress on parents, and you would think it would make them less reticent to have children. Of course, the countries that do this best are the Nordic countries, Norway, Sweden, Denmark. France has a pretty good program where childcare is offered on a sliding scale, where less affluent parents pay less. And that's relieving a great burden. It means that you can go back to work and one parent doesn't have to stay home with a child. That parent can continue to work, can continue to pursue their career, even though they have children. So these Nordic countries seem to be doing everything right. Another thing governments can do is offer free health care. If you have to pay a huge amount of money every month for your child's health care, then you're, again, going to be reticent to have a baby at all if you know that this huge cost is going to hit you. And again, the Nordic countries do pretty well on that. Health care is free, certainly for children. And there's a lot of social support services. For example, if your child has some serious disability, you know the state is going to step in and help with that. Whereas in America, you don't have many guarantees. You don't have free childcare. You don't have free health care unless you're especially poor. And you don't have any significant safety net should something go wrong in the raising of your child. There are so many things that can go wrong, and obviously the Nordic countries do a lot better job of supporting their families. So who is winning in this fertility game, the game of who's having the most babies? Well, let's look at Sweden. Sweden is doing everything right. It backs up its parents in every way possible. What is their fertility rate? In other words, how many babies are they having per woman? And right now it's about 1.8 babies per woman when you need 2.1 babies per woman to refresh the population. So here's a country that's doing everything right, spending huge amounts of money for an expensive social welfare system, and they're still getting only 1.8 babies per woman. Now look at the United States, which is doing everything wrong. It doesn't support its parents much in any way at all. It doesn't provide free childcare, doesn't provide free insurance. If something goes wrong with your baby, you're on your own. What is their fertility rate? It's 1.8, exactly the same as Sweden. So although this is only anecdotal, we have a country on one side that is doing everything it possibly can to encourage fertility, and you have another country that's doing virtually nothing, and their fertility rates are the same, and you could say, well, what's the point in doing anything at all? Likewise, we can look at the benefit called parental leave. That's when parents who have babies get time off to take care of their infants. Virtually the only country in the world that doesn't mandate this at the national level is the United States. Most other countries offer various forms of parental leave, ranging from a few weeks to a few months to over a year. And obviously the Nordic countries are well ahead in this. They offer very generous parental leave programs paid for largely by the government. So if you have a baby, you have time off before the baby is born and then time off after, according to the scheme of your particular government. And you would think this would encourage parenthood. You're essentially winning the lottery. If you have a baby, you win the lottery and you get a lot of time off, often at full pay or at partial pay. So is this actually encouraging people to have more babies? And again, it's hard to evaluate because there's no control group, but there is some anecdotal evidence. What is the country that has the most generous parental leave policy? And it's not in the Nordic countries. It turns out it is in Bulgaria, which happens to be the fastest shrinking country in Europe. Not only are the birth rates low, but lots of people are moving out. And Bulgaria offers 59 weeks of paid maternity leave. In other words, a mother gets a year off to care for her infant. And this program has apparently been around for a few years. You would think it would help improve the birth rate, but there's no evidence that it has. The fertility rate in Bulgaria is still 1.5 babies per woman, which is among the lowest in Europe. Now, these government programs to support families may be good policy. They may, in the long run, benefit the society. They may help raise better children. But there's no evidence that they in themselves improve fertility. That is, the number of babies being born, which is kind of discouraging. What it says to me is that people have babies for their own reasons, their own independent reasons, which have to do with their own psychology and their history and their desire to carry on their own traits and culture and various other personal reasons. And these incentives really don't enter into it. You either decide to have a baby for your own reasons, then take advantage of the incentives, but the incentives themselves don't change your thinking, don't change your behavior. In fact, there is only one thing that governments can do that has been proven effective in improving one's demographic condition, and that is admitting immigrants. Immigrants are a no-lose situation, at least economically. What you're doing is you're essentially stealing somebody else's talent. Some other country has invested in these babies and raised them to adulthood, and you're coming along and stealing them and sticking them into your economy, which is of great benefit to you. From an economic standpoint, there's almost no downside to immigration, as long as you're reasonably selective in who you admit. And unfortunately, many of the countries that are in desperate straits, who are losing absolute population, they are not open to immigrants. Japan is not open to immigrants. And Poland and Hungary are not open to immigrants. So they want things both ways. They're trying desperately to make new babies, which they can't do, and they're ignoring the resource of admitting new immigrants, which is something they could do. Immigrants don't cost a lot. The vast majority of them go to work immediately and start paying taxes immediately. You don't have to educate them. Unfortunately, immigration is a zero-sum game. If one country wins, another country loses. When an immigrant moves from one country to another and leaves behind his home country, he is depriving the home country of his talent and his tax revenue. And the home country loses its 20-year investment in this person. So you have a country like Bulgaria who's investing a lot in their youth. They have this generous parental leave program, and they have an educational system, and they pour all their effort into their youth, and their youth become adults, and they run away. So what immigration does is it makes the rich countries richer and the poor countries poorer. It's great for the countries like the United States and Sweden. Even though they can't produce enough babies themselves to sustain their population, they can always make up the difference by taking in talented immigrants. Unfortunately, the less attractive countries of the world can't do the same thing. They have to rely on their birth rate alone to sustain them, yet nothing they do is really going to help. And even if it did work, the rich countries are just going to steal your talent when these children become adults. It's kind of a hopeless situation, which is part of why I call my project Demographic Doom. The less advantaged countries are in a doom loop. No matter what they do, things keep getting worse, and they try everything in the book and they spend all sorts of money, but it's not going to help. The talent is still going to run away. So let's get back to the question of why these incentive programs don't work. And they don't work simply because the incentives to not have children are much more powerful than anything that a government can offer. So maybe the government of Sweden is offering generous childcare subsidies and maternal leave programs and all sorts of other services. Well, that's really only mitigating some of the cost of parenthood. Parenthood, no matter how you slice it, is extremely costly in money and in risk and in lost opportunities. And it's just one lifestyle of many that are possible. Throughout most of human history, people were stuck in the role that they were born in. If you were born a peasant, you stayed a peasant, and there weren't many distractions from having children. In modern times, we have much more freedom and upward mobility. Everybody is keenly aware that they can move up in the world, and they're aware of all the things that they don't have and aware of all the things that they could be doing with their lives. And they're faced with this huge buffet of choices, and having a child is just one item on the buffet. People still have children for powerful emotional reasons, and I think that they have them regardless of what the government has on offer. They have children for their own internal motivations, and what the government does is irrelevant to them. So we have some people filled with idealism who have these wonderful ideas about what parenthood would be like, and then they actually have a child, and it's way more difficult than they ever anticipated. Even in Sweden, you still have to take the kid home at night. You still have to entertain the kid and do all the things that parents need to do, which takes you away from anything else you might be doing. And after you've had a kid and realize how much work it is, then, well, you might have one more kid. But after that, you're kind of exhausted. You realize just what a pain this is, and you quit at 2 kids. And if we have only a small portion of the population taking that road and having any kids at all, then those 2 kids really aren't sufficient to refresh the population. So the choice for you as a young adult is you can pursue your career, you can travel the world, you can write a book, you can do all sorts of fantastic things, or you can have a child, which is going to take the air out of just about everything else that you do. And every young adult makes their own choice. That's what the kind of society we have. People make their own individual choices. They aren't forced to do things anymore. So unless a government wants to get really draconian and just lock people up in some kind of baby farm where they're forced to have children, you really can't take this choice away. Even in a place like China, where the government is God and can declare anything it wants, it really can't force people into a situation that's bad for them, that they know is bad for them, that's economically a losing proposition. Because ultimately, people look after their own self-interest. And for most people in the world, for most young adults in the world, having a baby just isn't in their self-interest. There is huge cost and very little benefit, at least in practical terms. So what hope is there? I think the only real hope is outside of the government's purview. I think that in some way people have to join together to raise children together in some sort of structure that's more efficient than the traditional nuclear family. And I would not expect the government to be able to organize something like that. It can perhaps facilitate it by staying out of the way, but I would want nothing to do with any government program that deliberately wanted to make babies. Governments can offer global programs like birth incentives available to anyone, but they are utterly incompetent and ill-equipped to make more granular decisions like who should mate with whom and who should be encouraged to have babies and who shouldn't, which is ultimately a decision that has to be made by somebody. Today, it is a decision made by couples. Couples decide on their own whether to have a baby, and they judge on their own whether they're equipped to handle it. It would be very scary to put such power into the hands of the government to make these decisions, but somebody has to make them. And I think the next step beyond a couple choosing to have children would be a group of adults choosing to have children. Because they are not the government, they can freely associate with each other based on capabilities, and they together can decide how and when to have children and how their resources should be spent. And before we have any kind of paradigm shift where we change the structure of families and start raising children communally, before any of that can happen, things have to get really bad. It has to be a situation where your whole society is dying because it's full of old people. At some point, someone would come up with something new. What I'm proposing is a family of a large number of children taken care of by a large number of adults that I call the modular family. I don't know if that's the best way, but before anybody adopts anything like that, they have to really be motivated in some way. And that's only going to happen if society is really in dire straits for lack of babies. Maybe the government can't do anything, but a group of adults can get together and say, well, how are we going to solve this? How are we going to preserve our way of life? And they, freely associating with each other, can do things that governments can't do. So governments will continue to offer these incentives. They offer them because there's a demand to do something. There's a political imperative that we have to do something. We have to rescue ourselves. And so the governments will do things. These things that they do will have little to no effect, but they'll have to do them anyway because that's what they need to do to be seen as addressing the problem. So Russia will continue to offer its baby bonus, and it will continue to have no real effect on birth rates. But the leaders of Russia really don't care. Your Putins and your populist leaders, they just want their own power, and they don't really care about the future of their country. So expect more incentive programs, expect more attempts at family-friendly policies. I don't disapprove of them. They are good for society. They're just not going to do the thing that they're supposed to do, which is increase the number of babies.